Welcome, everyone, to a brand new show. As many of you know, I actually got my start in the industry at PlayerProfiler, and a lot of what they do is just awesome content in general. They are in many ways the kings of a podcast network. Couldn't be more happy to announce that we're beginning a 4-part series, the 33rd Team and PlayerProfiler. For episode 1, we're going to be diving into the quarterback position. Then we'll dive in next week to running backs, the following week, wide receivers, the week after that, tight ends. And then we're going to end with a big show for the good people at the end of November. You'll notice some analysts from PlayerProfiler popping into more 33rd Team podcasts these next few weeks. And conversely, some 33rd Team analysts will also be popping on to some PlayerProfiler shows. Without further ado, let me introduce Theo Gremminger, the podcast director at the 33rd Team, respected analyst, respected high-stakes player. He is the OG fantasy on Twitter. And then most of you tuning in already know Ryan Reynolds at Ryan Reynolds NFL, the associate director of fantasy and betting at the 33rd Team, or as I like to call him, the more famous Ryan Reynolds. I'll be your host for this 4-part series, Josh Larky. You can find me on Twitter at JLarkyTweets. Guys, let's dive right in. We're going to be talking about rookie year quarterbacks, followed by the second year quarterbacks. And we'll end the show with a little bit of Caleb Williams talk. Let's start with Bryce Young. He was a 2-year starter at Alabama. He won the Heisman in 2021. He had nearly 4,900 passing yards that year, 47 passing touchdowns. He only threw 7 picks. He was throwing to NFL receivers like Jamison Williams, John Mechie. Both of them left for the NFL in 2022. And despite the worst supporting cast, he still averaged the same yards per pass attempt the year after his Heisman win, still threw 32 touchdowns, only 5 interceptions. If he weren't 6 foot, 195 pounds, soaking wet, he would have been a borderline generational quarterback prospect, and the Panthers traded up with the Bears to take him with the first pick in this year's draft. Ryan, let's talk about what Bryce Young has put on film through 5 starts.
You know, as all three of us know and everyone watching this knows, he's struggled so far. That wasn't a big surprise for me. The Panthers' most difficult schedule stretch of the season came in their first 6 games before their Week 7 bye. I know from an offensive Rookie of the Year perspective, entering the year, my game plan was, let's leave him alone until the bye week. Let's see what happens there. Obviously, he hasn't built enough of a foundation yet to compete in that race. But, you know, he's struggled. Part of that's the Panthers' skill group is, you know, maybe the worst in the league all around. Their offensive line's been worse than we expected too. So I give him a bit of a pass to this point. But my bigger concern is he's already missed a game, and like you said, he's on the smaller side in terms of NFL quarterbacks, but has potential as a play extender. My favorite thing about him sometimes is that he has some good sleight of hand and he makes some good decisions. And by sleight of hand, I mean ball fakes, looking receivers off. I've seen some positives in that regard, but you know, I'm hoping that over the next few weeks they have the Texans, the Colts, and the Bears, that we see more from them than we have.
Theo, how should we be handling Bryce Young in Dynasty? And let's frame it as, has anything changed for you about him from draft day in April to what's now nearly the midpoint of the 2023 season?
No, he was a guy that we were always kind of behind consensus on. We had him consistently behind CJ Stroud in our Dynasty rankings, in our rookie draft rankings. He's just somewhat limited in what he can give us as a fantasy football player. He's a smaller quarterback who lacks scrambling ability. He's had 1 game with 3 passing touchdowns, but I think it's a little bit concerning the number of picks we've seen. He's been a little bit looser with the ball than I would have anticipated. And I think that he really lacks the weapons. Adam Thielen is playing just out of his mind, but they really need to go get Bryce Young, probably before the trade deadline. They need to go get him another wide receiver and kind of see where he's at. But in terms of Dynasty, he's a hold or a buy low if somebody's looking to sell, because he's very insulated as a long-term starter. There's a lot of guys we'll talk about today where like their long-term viability is not necessarily there. Bryce Young is going to be the quarterback for Carolina for many, many years to come. And if he fails out of Carolina, somebody else is going to give him another chance, because number 1 pick quarterbacks get chance after chance after chance.
Yeah, I think a great example of that is Baker Mayfield, still getting another chance. Currently the Buccaneers starting quarterback. For Dynasty rankings, our own Ian Miller has him ranked 14th. Player Profiler has him very similarly at 15th. At that point, I think we're nitpicking, but I'd say it feels like we're both trending towards maybe slightly below consensus on Bryce Young and Dynasty. Let's move on to CJ Stroud. Stroud started 2 seasons at Ohio State. He threw 44 touchdowns in 2021, then 41 touchdowns last year. He was only intercepted 6 times in each season. The efficiency numbers much better for Stroud than Young, but Stroud was throwing to a wide receiver group that included Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, Jackson Smith-Njigba, Marvin Harrison, among others. The Texans took him at the 2nd overall, right after Bryce Young. But to Stroud's credit, there were rumors in March and April reflected in the betting markets that the Panthers had been considering Stroud at the 1st overall pick. Through 6 games, Stroud's averaging 277 pass yards a game. He's thrown 9 touchdowns, only 1 interception. His 7.8 yards per attempt is 4th at the position, despite playing with a supporting cast that definitely inspired minimal confidence to begin the season. Ryan, I've rattled off some stats, but you've watched every snap of every game since 2014. You're still alive to tell about it. Has the tape looked as good as the stats through 6 games? And has your playstyle comp changed for him since draft day?
Well, that's a great question, Josh. I compared him to Dak Prescott. And I think I was waiting to see more of that towards the end of the season. The fact that we're seeing that right now is, a pleasant surprise for Texans fans for sure. He's been extremely efficient, like you said. He's had 2 big spike games. My biggest concern here, the biggest compliment that I'll give Stroud is he did a lot of this behind a Texans offensive line that was missing 2 or 3 starters, in one game 4 against some pretty good pass rushes. So him playing this well this early, I mean, we're looking at maybe a top 10 quarterback in the league long term. And, he's even ran a little bit more than I thought too. So that's obviously a positive for fantasy.
Theo, talk to me about Stroud's streaming appeal for fantasy this year. And then if we look many years out in the future for dynasty managers, is it an overreaction if we just start aggressively moving Stroud up the rankings with each passing game?
No, I don't think that that's any sort of bad process. I think that he's the real deal. When we talked about his fantasy ceiling this past offseason, he was a guy that I thought would be like a Kirk Cousins, a guy who would give us some fantasy production, but not really break the roof off. I think he's actually closer to a Joe Burrow level talent. And I like Ryan's Dak Prescott, comparison as well. That sort of guy that, having a top 5 quarterback season or seasons is in the realm of possibilities for him. I mean, bottom line, I think CJ Stroud is a stud. And I think that the system that they have for him, constantly putting 3 wide receivers out on the field with him, has been really beneficial to his game. But he doesn't get sacked and he doesn't throw interceptions. So he's able to see the field so well, like a real veteran presence to him, despite being a younger rookie quarterback. It's such a big L for people who actually care about things like the S2 test. The whole company should go out of business, if you ask me, based on how CJ Stroud is looking. The guy reads an NFL defense as well as better than half the quarterbacks out there. And now we see the bye week for him. I wonder if they're going to try to mix things up and get even a little bit more aggressive. It's a perfect week to do so. I think Houston could put some points on the board against Carolina this week.
I'd agree as well. Reminder, Player Profiler had CJ Stroud ahead of Bryce Young. We had them in the same tier. We actually had Young a click ahead of Stroud like most. And like most, it looks through 7 weeks like we are incorrect. Stroud definitively the better dynasty asset at this point. We have him at quarterback 8. Player Profiler has him at quarterback 11. Though if you look at actual tiers and the lifetime value system that Player Profiler does so well, you'll see that we're actually both quite bullish on CJ Stroud relative to most other dynasty quarterbacks. Also, speaking of Player Profiler, their all-in package has been reduced to $85 rest of season. So if you're suddenly going, oh, I've got some surprise dynasty contending teams that I didn't expect, I need a little more help, $85 rest of season. If that's too high and you were hoping it would be $75, well, congratulations. Promo code Theo. Theo gets you $10 off. It gets you to that $75 price point. You get their data analysis suite of tools, weekly rankings, dynasty rankings, the lifetime values for players that I mentioned that I would say is pretty pioneering in the industry. I know it's influenced a lot of the stuff that I've done since leaving Player Profiler, and you get all of their DFS tools as well. Let's talk about Anthony Richardson. Richardson, for those who didn't know, you should all know at this point, but he's the most athletic quarterback in NFL history. He's 6'4", 244 pounds. He ran a 4.43 40-yard dash. His vertical jump was over 40 inches. Put another way, Richardson's combine metrics were similar or better than Christian McCaffrey across the board, even though Richardson is 40 pounds heavier. He only started 1 year at Florida, and it was definitely a mixed bag as a passer. He had 2,500 passing yards. He had 17 touchdowns, but he threw at 9 picks. That's not a very good ratio. Though I will say the supporting cast at Florida was so much worse than what CJ Stroud had, so much worse than what Bryce Young had. Richardson also contributed 650 rushing yards and 9 rushing touchdowns last year in his lone season as a college starter as well. In the NFL, it's been a tiny sample. He's appeared in 4 games, but 2 of them he left before halftime due to injury. I'd say that what we saw was a better passer than someone like myself anticipated. And as a runner, he reached 10 carries in both of his full games. He'll now be missing the rest of the season, undergoing shoulder surgery. Ryan, what did you see from Richardson in what we'll say amounted to a little bit under 3 full games? And do you think he's going to have to modify the way that he plays football at the NFL level to stay healthier next year?
I'll answer that second question first. Yes. I mean, all NFL quarterbacks that run need to take less contact. Josh Allen's pretty much the only guy that can, take on hits from linebackers like they're nothing. Anthony Richardson, obviously, he has to slide more, especially since, he's you have Lamar Jackson, and then probably him and Jalen Hurts are the 3 best rushing quarterbacks in the league. So he definitely needs to take less contact. That said, I thought I liked him more as a passer than most did coming into the season. I thought the ceiling there was a bit similar to Cam Newton, where we're not exactly talking about Tom Brady here, but they have a dynamic athlete that can make plays downfield and be kind of at least semi-efficient in the short to intermediate game. And I think he even surpassed my expectations on that front. I think his match with Sean Steichen's great. Steichen helped develop Jalen Hurts, and I don't think there's the Colts, apart from the injury situation with Richardson, they have to be very encouraged about what they saw out of him in his first 3 games as an NFL quarterback.
Guys, that's Ryan Reynolds, NFL on Twitter, the better Ryan Reynolds. Theo, how do we even begin to value Richardson in Dynasty? What we saw was so tantalizing for fantasy points, yet there's really not many good player comps out there, and now Dynasty managers are sitting on the rest of the 2023 season with a guy that's not starting for them each week.
Well, I think Ryan made a great point about Shane Steichen and how he's set up for success in Indianapolis. The injuries are very concerning, but I'm kind of less concerned about a shoulder injury long term than I would have been if it was a lower body injury, like some reconstructive knee surgery. And he's only 21 years old, so he'll be 22 years old next season with a good situation around him with receivers who we think are pretty good players in Michael Pittman and Josh Downs, as well as Jonathan Taylor, now insulated with that contract. So for me, I don't want to play fantasy football in a scared way. I want to kind of swing for the fences and go for these high upside plays. And Anthony Richardson right now, if you're a productive struggle team or a rebuilding team, this is a perfect guy for you to go get. If you have a quarterback who's scoring well and has fantasy viability, this is a perfect 2-for-1 type trade to go get Anthony Richardson, because Anthony Richardson kind of changed the outlook for the teams that had him short term, where dynasty managers were not looking at some big rebuild with him. He was giving you 2 top 5 weeks kind of out the gate. And Josh, we talked about him potentially breaking the all-time scoring record set by Cam Newton in his rookie year for most fantasy points by a quarterback. That's how good he looked. So I think he can get better at the mental aspects of the game in terms of keeping himself healthy, but the physical tools are all there, and the long-term support is there with Indianapolis. So I'm still bullish on Richardson, even though I hate seeing him leaving multiple games to injuries. It's just it makes you think about RG3 and situations like that in the past. It's kind of concerning, but I think we have to swing for the fences. We have to roster high upside players in Dynasty if we want a chance to win Dynasty leagues.
Theo is at the OG Fantasy on Twitter. Gotta love the way that he talks about football, and few people have the track record he has with high stakes, with the analysis that he brings to the table, blending film, data, dynasty rankings. We have him quarterback 10. Player profiler, slightly more bullish, quarterback 9. Looks like overall we're both quite optimistic about his career potential. Before moving to the second-year quarterbacks, let's just very, very quickly mention the two other guys in this class that deserve a mention. One, Will Levis. He was frequently mocked as a first-round NFL draft pick. He's got the prototypical size, arm strength, overall athleticism to be an NFL quarterback. There's some questionable decision-making. He started 2 years at Kentucky. The passing efficiency in terms of yards per attempt was actually fairly strong. The issue was there's far too many interceptions littered throughout his game logs. The Titans took him at pick 33 early in the second round of this recent NFL draft. He'll be starting his first NFL game this Sunday. Good timing on the podcast. It's a home game. They'll face the Falcons. Ryan, talk to me about what to expect from his first NFL start and what should we be looking for from him in this game plan in his first game.
I've never been a big Will Levis guy. I'll say two things positive about him, though. Mike Vrabel's a very good football coach, and Will Levis eating a rotten banana almost seemed like a call for help from Mike Vrabel. Like, please come draft me. I'm your kind of guy. I fit with the Tennessee Titans. That said, watching this guy start his first NFL game behind, what were maybe the worst offensive line in the league is concerning. Atlanta's actually given up the 9th fewest points per game, too, this year, so they're facing a real defense this week. So, thankfully, he's starting over Malik Willis, because that was a little alarming itself, gentlemen, that the Titans thought so little of him 2 weeks ago that they actually went to Willis before Levis when Ryan Tannehill got hurt. So glad they're pivoting there. Just at least like flashes, consistency would be lovely. I don't think we should count on that, but at least flashes that he can be an NFL passer is what I'm looking for this week.
Yeah, I know that I'll have to move DeAndre Hopkins up my weekly fantasy rankings. Malik Willis yet to reach 100 passing yards in a game as an NFL quarterback. Will Levis, I think we can definitively say that outside of injury, he should top 100 passing yards on Sunday. Theo, quarterbacks like Will Levis, they're notoriously hard to value in Dynasty. I'd say that given the second round draft capital in his profile, he's likely just a 0 long-term. But the tools, as I mentioned before, they're in place for some kind of productive fantasy asset if he gets real opportunities. Talk me through how we balance these two factors and how Player Profiler's lifetime value is going to reflect that.
Yeah, so Levis is an interesting one because he's got a big arm. I'll say that about him. Like he definitely has a big arm. And from a fantasy perspective, you mentioned DeAndre Hopkins. Maybe he has tunnel vision, which sometimes we get, like these rookie quarterbacks in their first game. They'll fixate on their alpha target. So we could get like a sneaky DeAndre Hopkins game. But you bring up the turnovers and you bring up the second round draft capital. There hasn't been a whole lot of hits from second round quarterbacks. Like Jalen Hurts is the big standout, like outlier here. But kind of chasing it's not a great bet historically when these guys fall to that range. And I don't know. To me, I see him as like a replacement level talent. And Tennessee, the wheels could completely fall out from under them. They're already starting to trade guys. So they might have exposure to a couple quarterbacks in this class. And Levis's window will close very quickly if they take a quarterback in the first round this year, which I think would absolutely be in the realm of possibilities. So we're not that high on him. And I'm not that high on him. I just think that this is, like Ryan said, I think this is a game where you stream the Falcons defense, expect to see Vrabel is going to protect him as much as possible in the game plan. You're going to see a lot of the big dog, maybe a little bit more Tyjae Spears, and a very limited target tree to keep things simple for him.
Yeah, Theo, you bring up a good point there. He's going to have to play really, really well in Tannehill's absence because the Titans right now look like one of the worst NFL teams, and there's some very, very good college quarterbacks in the upcoming class. Before we hit the second year, guys, Hendon Hooker, we'll mention him. 5-year college player, started 2 years at Virginia Tech, started 2 years at Tennessee. Those final 2 years at Tennessee were promising, finally put it together as a passer. He averaged 3,000 passing yards per season in those 2 years, a total of 58 passing touchdowns to only 5 interceptions in that 2-year span. Decent size, prolific college runner, over 2,000 rushing yards, 25 rushing touchdowns during those 4 years as a starter. But the bad, tore his ACL 11 months ago. He's already 25 years old. He turns 26 in January. And the Lions took him in the 3rd round of the NFL draft this year. Ryan, do you have any hope for a player like this at the NFL level? Or should we simply just begin to move on to these 2nd-year quarterbacks?
I think he's an interesting dart throw because of his landing spot. Especially coming off the injury, him sitting in Detroit, he'll probably never benefit from Ben Johnson. I imagine he's going to be a head coach next year. But premium offensive line, Amon-Ra St. Brown, our guy Amon-Ra St. Brown, Josh, Jameson Williams, Sam Laporta, Jahmyr Gibbs. That's a pretty good young supporting cast if he gets an opportunity to play. But obviously Detroit's probably going to extend Jared Goff at this point, I think.
That's certainly what it seems like. Theo, let's talk about Hooker and Dynasty. You think he's a trade throw-in? Are you just staying away? Is this just insurance if you have Jared Goff on your Dynasty team and this is like a spot starter due to injury? Where should we think about Mr. Hooker?
I'd like to clarify that Amon-Ra St. Brown is all of our guys. Guys, we're claiming him too at Player Profiler, not just 33rd team.
That's fair.
The Podfather was all over the Sun God as well this summer. So glad, like great minds think alike, guys. We're all loving the Sun God. But I think like the best thing you said, Josh, was if you're at all worried about long-term viability for Jared Goff and you want to have his potential backup next year, then I think that's the only kind of fantasy managers who really need to aggressively go and roster him. Like you said, he's an overaged prospect coming off of a major surgery. The Lions this offseason said they don't expect him to play for a very long time. So there's sort of like a cryptic nature for that. So again, Jared Goff, I think, is the kind of guy where people want him to be this replacement guy, but he keeps outplaying that and he keeps winning games. So he's winning games. And he's also being pretty productive. So it's sort of like an Alex Smith situation where a great quarterback could come along and take Jared Goff's job. But I don't think they're just going to make a change just to make a change with a guy like Hendon Hooker. I think Goff is pretty safe right now as a dynasty asset and as the Detroit Lions starting QB, especially with them, potentially winning double-digit games, making the playoffs, and probably winning a playoff game based on how they're looking.
Amon-Ra St. Brown was a consensus 2nd-round pick in fantasy drafts this year. The 33rd team, Player Profiler, both had him in the 1st round. I think he's going to have a big second half of this season. For the 33rd team, my fantasy rankings hit the site yesterday. They're free to view. So did Ryan's power rankings. My rest of season rankings and trade value chart, you get that nice downloadable color-coded PDF like last week. Those will be out later this afternoon. I will finish those up after the show and send them off to the editing team. Let's talk some 2nd-year quarterbacks, guys. Kenny Pickett. He started 4 years at Pitt. He never popped until year 5. He was older than everyone, but he threw for 4,300 yards, 42 touchdowns, only 7 picks. He's got some sneaky mobility as a runner. He had 800 rushing yards in college, 20 rushing touchdowns during his career. Steelers took him at pick 20 last year. The rookie season was rough. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. More throws to the other team than touchdowns. I believe it was 7 touchdowns, 9 interceptions. He reached 200 passing yards in just 4 of his 12 rookie year starts. This year, the supporting cast, the offensive line, were improved during the offseason, but the injury bug struck Deontay Johnson, Pat Freiermuth. Even Kenny Pickett himself had a knee injury earlier this year. Ryan, the good news. He's coming off his best game of 2023. Deontay Johnson is back. The Steelers just beat the Rams 24-17 in week 7. What have you seen from him to this point? Are you optimistic about the rest of season outlook with him?
I think when you talk about Kenny Pickett, it's important to talk about NFL quarterbacks in general. If we're being honest with ourselves, there's 10, maybe 12 guys that are guys that you want long-term. There's maybe another 10 that are viable NFL starters that, you re-sign them because the other 10 teams will take them off your hands in a heartbeat. That's why Daniel Jones got paid $40 million a year this year. So I think in that realm, can Pickett be around 20? I think he can. He played well in games late last year, played when it mattered. Like you said, this year, the Steelers actually have a pretty good young supporting cast, but they've only played 1 game together now, which was last week. So I don't have a ton of enthusiasm, but can he be, a league average starting quarterback long-term? And the Steelers are going to give him at least 4 years. They're one of those teams. They're not going to push the eject button too soon, but yeah, I think the ceiling we're talking about here is, if he's the 18th best quarterback in year 4 in the league, that'd probably be a good thing for him.
Yeah, Steelers haven't had a losing season in, I believe it's about 2 decades at this point. So it's
Yeah.
not like they're going to have a high draft pick anytime soon to replace him. That's a good point there. Theo, we all play Dynasty. How should we handle small hands Kenny Pickett?
He would be the kind of guy that if I could trade up from him, maybe move him for like an older veteran or move him for somebody who maybe has less long-term viability, but a higher upside that can help me win dynasty games, then I'm doing it. I just look at Kenny Pickett and yes, they won this past week and they've been winning a few games and they're a great organization, but we've seen now, I believe it's 19 starts for Kenny Pickett, and he's had one single game where he passed for more than 300 yards. He's had one single game where he's passed for 2 touchdowns. Like he's got one game with multiple touchdown passes. That's insane. And he's, I believe his weekly high for a finish, and I'd have to double check this one, but this year it's quarterback 15 was his weekly finish. That was his high for his career. And I don't think he topped that last year either. So Kenny Pickett has just been so limited in the fantasy production he can give us. Yes, he was a first-round draft pick, but there comes a point where this is the definition of I really want to pivot up from Kenny Pickett to a better talent. I think he kind of limits what Pittsburgh can do offensively and limits the upside of their team. When you talk about going into a playoffs against a guy like Lamar Jackson and a guy like Josh Allen and a guy like Patrick Mahomes and a guy like Joe Burrow, it's bad. It's bad news for Pittsburgh long term to have him behind center. So I just don't trust him enough. I think if you're looking to move on from him, you kind of play up the fact that he is a second-year player. He was a first-round draft pick. But at the end of the day, I just don't see the talent and I don't see the fantasy scoring.
We don't necessarily see the talent or the fantasy scoring either. We have him 26th in the dynasty ranks. You guys have him 25. It looks like neither of our companies are particularly excited. And guys, Theo is the OG fantasy on Twitter. Make sure you're checking out all of his work, not just on Twitter, but on PlayerProfiler.com. Let's turn to Sam Howell. I think we can view Sam Howell a little like Baker Mayfield with no draft capital. Howell had 3 productive seasons at North Carolina. He totaled more than 10,000 passing yards, 92 passing touchdowns, only 23 picks. He had a little over 1,000 rushing yards on the ground too, though more than 800 of that was in his final season when they really let him loose. Bad supporting cast. He's running for his life, and he was actually relatively effective doing it. He fell to the Commanders, though, 5th round of last year's draft. But as a starter this year, he has been the starter. Negatively, he's pacing to break the NFL record for sacks taken in a season by a quarterback by about 20. Positively, there have been some flashes. The Commanders are actually somehow still in the playoff picture to this point. Ryan, we were definitively not.
Between Baker Mayfield and Daniel Jones. One thing that I've noticed a few times now is he's actually a pretty good passer. He's, and I told you guys before we went live today is I view him as the kind of quarterback that can get you into trouble as an organization. He's just talented enough where you can talk yourself into him long term, but I don't think you're going to win anything with him. As I said on, I think it was the waiver wire show, I think when Case Keenum won 13 games with the Vikings, I think Sam Howell has that kind of season in him where he could take a really good roster to the NFC Championship. But in terms of consistency, I don't think it's there really.
Theo, job security is the big issue with Howell and Dynasty. Player Profiler is actually quite optimistic on him. Got him at quarterback 22 overall. That's higher than Kenny Pickett. That is crazy. Did you know Kenny Pickett was a first-round pick? And then you look, and we have him quarterback 23, also ahead of Kenny Pickett. Very, very interesting. What should we do in Dynasty at this point? It seems like we're all kind of bullish on him.
I think with Sam Howell, just treat him like he's 10 years older than he is. And that makes your entire dynasty process better because he's been very good for fantasy this year, especially in Superflex. This is a guy, he's got a 5 top 14 finishes, weekly finishes. The other 2 games were very, very bad. But he does 2 things that will prevent him from being a long-term NFL quarterback. He throws a lot of interceptions. Ryan, I believe he's on pace for 17 interceptions. And he is on pace to take the most sacks in NFL history. And it's so funny. The guy, it's like he's completely blind to certain pass rushes. He doesn't pick it up. It's crazy. So I really like Sam Howell as a fantasy football player, but in terms of like an NFL organization can't look at Sam Howell and say, this is the guy that's going to take me to the promised land.
Yeah.
But he's very fun for us. You think about like the Jameis Winston season a couple years back, where he throws for so many touchdown passes, throws so many interceptions, and then the next year he's on someone's bench. That could be like Sam Howell. And also, Josh, he has no insulation with his draft capital. This is a day 3 guy. So the day 3 guys are already the NFL teams are already getting ready to kind of push him to the side. But for us, go get him. This is like, if you have Kenny Pickett, I'm making a Kenny Pickett for Sam Howell trade all day long, because I know that Sam Howell is going to give me more fantasy production. And a year from now, I don't know if Kenny Pickett's going to be a starting quarterback for Pittsburgh.
Smart stuff on both ends. Ryan, I really like the Case Keenum comparison. And then Theo, on your end, I love the way that you framed just add 10 years to his age, and now you can properly value him in Dynasty. Speaking of Theo and Player Profiler, Ryan will be on First Class Fantasy tomorrow. That is the show that Theo and Billy Muzio host. So check that out in the Player Profiler podcast feeds. Check it out on their YouTube. I will be on The Game Plan with Maddie Kiwoom this Saturday for Player Profiler. We're going to try and help you win your fantasy leagues this year. In general, there's no company out there that has more free podcast, YouTube content than Player Profiler. Their media is all free. And we will have the running back, the wide receiver, and the tight end versions of this podcast out in the next 3 weeks. Gents, let's turn to Desmond Ridder. 4-year starter at Cincinnati. 3-to-1 touchdown to interception ratio across those 4 seasons in college. That's very good. But overall, the efficiency just wasn't that great when you look at actual pass yards per attempt. He had more than 2,000 rush yards in his career. He ran a 4.5 240 at the combine. That's a similar time to Russell Wilson for context. So a very, very plus runner, but not quite super special for fantasy production. He started 4 games to close out last year. He finally unseated Marcus Mariota at the end of the year. The results were mostly not good. This year, positively, he started every game for Atlanta. Negatively, he might be holding them back at sometimes. Ryan, what have you seen from Ridder? And do you think in any way he's a long-term solution for this team? And I'll add on another element. Do you think he or Howell is more likely to start games for their team next year? And Theo, you're going to get that same question as well, since I think that's kind of a fun dichotomy.
I think Howell's more interesting. And like Theo said, he's brave too. Like, while he'll take sacks, like, you got to give him some credit. It's one of the reasons I like about him. He's tough. Desmond Ridder, wasn't crazy about him at all coming out. I was definitely below consensus on him. And now, gentlemen, it's 2023, and opposing defenses are basically saying to the Atlanta Falcons, we want to make Desmond Ridder beat us. That's not a good thing. That's not a positive at all. You know, he's had some productive games over the last 3 weeks, but turnovers have been a problem. This week he gets the Kevin Byard-less Titans secondary. Big upside there. Falcons offensive line has a shot to mitigate the Titans push too. So pretty good situation this week. But, you know, we talked about this in week 2 or so, Josh. If Matthew Stafford was the Falcons quarterback, they're a legitimate threat in the NFC. With Desmond Ridder, you know, if they win the division, they're going to lose in the first round, probably to the Lions. Maybe they're the team that gets fed to the Lions this year, Theo.
Oh, I like that one, Ryan.
That's a good one. Theo, before we talk about Ridder too much, quick hitter. Who do you think is more likely to start games next year for their respective team, Howell or Ridder?
Gosh, that's a really tough one. I will go Howell. It just seems like Atlanta is going to replace Ridder this offseason. I will go with Howell.
I think we're all in agreement there. Ridder has reached 19 fantasy points in 4 of his 7 games, though. We got to give him a little credit.
Yeah.
He's reached it in each of his past 3. At the very least, he's in the streaming conversation. It looks like we're all a little bit concerned, though, about long-term viability. We kind of all seem to view Howell as a hold or a buy. How would you treat Ridder in Dynasty, Theo?
I think he's a hold because, you know, he's probably more valuable to me than what I would get back in terms of a trade asset. Unless you find somebody who's willing to try to get younger at the position and is willing to trade me like a veteran that I'm going to get more. Like Matt Stafford's a great name. Like Matt Stafford, a lot of people look at him as kind of like a dead dynasty asset, but the production is there, and he's locked in this season. But Ritter, for what it's worth, he's a locked-in super flex starter. He's quarterback 19 on the year. He had back-to-back 300 plus passing yard performances. The passing volume's actually been better for Atlanta than it was last year, and I think Ritter has benefited from that. The turnovers killed him. This could have been a third straight 300-yard passing performance, but he had the 3 fumbles. So he's kind of shooting himself in the foot with that. And like Ryan says, he's got a chance to bounce back against Tennessee, a defense that's, people have to pass on, difficult team to run on. So it's up in the air, but Atlanta's winning kind of despite Ritter. And I think at the end of the day, they have too much talent on both sides of the ball that they're not going to make it an improvement at the position. You hear like Justin Fields that going back home to the state of Georgia, something like that would make a lot of sense. I think that this is going to be, like you alluded to, Josh, this is a quarterback class with a lot of very appealing prospects, which all that means is there's going to be a number of more quarterbacks boxed out of their current jobs and available to some of these teams just looking to pivot.
Player Profiler has Desmond Ritter at quarterback 28. Last week, Ian Miller had him at quarterback 32, but he had another solid performance. He had the rushing touchdown. Ian's dynasty ranks will be updated on the site later today. We'll see if he starts to inch a little closer to Player Profiler's 28 ranking. The last guy we're going to talk about before we discuss a little Caleb Williams is Brock Purdy. How could we not? Purdy was a 4-year starter at Iowa State. He threw for some solid yardage, efficiency, decision-making, a little questionable at times. He only reached 20 passing touchdowns in one of those 4 years. He never quite reached 4,000 passing yards in any of those seasons. But I think we actually saw this on Monday night against the Vikings. He had a couple plays where you're like, oh, this guy is a little bit faster than we'd expect. He had at least 230 rushing yards in all 4 of his college seasons. As we all know at this point, it's been beaten to death. The 49ers took him, Mr. Irrelevant, the final pick in last year's draft. But with the Niners, he's been a revelation. His career quarterback rating is now 107. That's the highest ever. For context, Mahomes is at 105. Aaron Rodgers is at 103. Peyton Manning is at 97. However, I remember Jimmy Garoppolo. I am old enough to remember Jimmy Garoppolo playing 6 years with the 49ers. Garoppolo's yards per pass attempt in that Shanahan system was 8.3. That is actually higher than Mahomes' career average. So, Ryan, how should we be balancing the scheme with what Purdy has done through his 12 regular season NFL starts?
Yeah, I mean, they've been better with Purdy than Garoppolo, so I think I can say Purdy's better than Garoppolo. I'll just come out and say that. But this is how I'd frame it. I've said this to you, Josh. Pressure management is a silent killer for NFL quarterbacks long term. Entering the season, that was my biggest concern with Purdy. And after the Steelers game in Week 1, I stuck the 49ers at the top spot in my power rankings after that for weeks and weeks until they lost 2 games. Because Purdy is actually is rock solid in pressure management. That's the best thing I have to say about him. Quick processor, throws good intermediate crosses, good in the short to intermediate game. Not a great thrower downfield, I'd say, but he's good. I think where we both have him ranked is where he belongs in terms of both NFL prospects and fantasy prospects. That said, gentlemen, if Brock Purdy was playing behind the injured Giants offensive line right now, the Giants offense wouldn't function with Purdy either. So we definitely have to take scheme into account here.
Guys, no one talks about football the way Ryan does. Love to hear it. Make sure you're following him at Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. Check out his work on the 33rdteam.com. Theo, this is another really tough dynasty eval. Like what Ryan said, there's the scheme, but also the fantasy production has been there at times. The efficiency has been incredible. So for dynasty, where do you see him 2 years from now?
I honestly see him as the starting quarterback for the San Francisco 49ers, unless we get some sort of incredible flame out in the playoffs. That's kind of the X factor, is the fantasy playoffs, because San Francisco is going to be in a position this year. Certainly the lost a minute. If we had this conversation like 2 weeks ago, we'd all be like just a little bit more bullish. The Minnesota game was not great. But I think, missing Trent Williams, missing Deebo Samuel, you get a big asterisk there. But Brock Purdy's had 4 QB1 weeks this season. This is a player that affords San Francisco the luxury of having a quarterback on a rookie contract. And I don't think they're ever going to have to give him as big of a contract as some of these other quarterbacks as well. I think there'll be a little bit of a discount with him unless he goes out and wins a Super Bowl. So I'm into Brock Purdy. I think Brock Purdy is a dynasty buy, not a dynasty sell. I don't think the market has kind of caught up with kind of what he is. He has fantasy production. He has the coaching staff loving him. This is a Shanahan guy. Mentioned Jimmy Garoppolo, Trey Lance. They move on from those guys. This is a Brock Purdy show. We love the quality of the weapons around him and the organization. So I'm big into Brock Purdy. I think he's a long-term solution at quarterback for San Francisco. And I think if you can get him as a quarterback 2 for your Superflex Dynasty teams, you're looking great. That's just exactly the kind of guy you want there. I think he's going to finish as a QB1 this season and for many years to come.
The OG Fantasy on Twitter. Theo, I love what you said about the contract in particular, because yes, these next few years, he will be set up for success because he's not just a rookie contract quarterback, but the last pick in the NFL draft rookie contract quarterback. We currently have him quarterback 16 in Dynasty. Player Profiler a little more excited at quarterback 14. I think I might lean with Player Profiler on this one. I think he's got some long-term viability. And I think he's going to be surrounded by some pretty good weapons for these
Billy
next few years.
Billy Muzio wants him to be like quarterback 9, Josh. There's a lot of internal pressure to get him up from Billy Muzio. That's the 49ers fan in Muzio a little bit, but loves him.
Yeah, anyone that has like a custom Deebo Samuel painting or whatever the heck he has in his basement, I'm going to go ahead and say there's maybe just a sliver of bias there. Ryan, maybe you can hash that out with Theo and Billy tomorrow on First Class Fantasy. Speaking of Ryan, his expert picks and predictions for every game will be on the 33rdteam.com tomorrow. Join our Discord. It's linked in all our articles on the 33rdteam.com. It's linked in Ryan's Twitter at Ryan Reynolds NFL. It's linked in my Twitter at JLarky Tweets and the Player Profiler Discord. Join that one too. They're both free. Player Profiler's Discord is prominently linked in the Roto Underworld Twitter account. And one last note, we are going to have the one, the only, the Podfather on an upcoming podcast very shortly, so be on the lookout for that. Ryan, Theo, we made it. We hit the first year. We hit the second year quarterbacks. Let's talk about the golden boy of next year, Caleb Williams. Theo, which team do you want him to go to?
I'll say like kind of an unpopular team here is I would love to see Caleb Williams end up being a New England Patriot. This is a ugly offense. This is the second lowest scoring team in the entire NFL right now. There's a lot of talk about how Bill Belichick's done. This is his last year. They're going to move on. I would love to see Caleb Williams come back and just rescue that ship, the sinking ship, and have them play beautiful offensive football and kind of resuscitate Bill Belichick. I think that would be just a fantastic storyline. And I'm probably the only one that will say New England if you ask like 20 people.
I like that answer. Ryan, I feel like an impression is coming, which I'm excited about. Theo has not heard this yet. He's going to enjoy this one as well. Where do you think Caleb Williams ends up?
Chicago Bears. The Bears. You know, the good people of Chicago deserve a quarterback like Caleb Williams. You know, he might walk right in and be the best quarterback in the history of the franchise. You know, no respect to Jim McMahon there, obviously. Kidding a little bit there. Got a lot to prove still. But, you know, this is what I'll say to you, gentlemen. When I watched Patrick Mahomes coming out of college, I loved the landing spot because he was excellent out of structure, and Andy Reid was going to help him in structure. It was a perfect marriage. Patrick Mahomes is, you know, if you told me right now, guys, that you think he's the best quarterback of all time, I wouldn't give you a ton of pushback. Wouldn't be my answer, but I wouldn't give you a ton of pushback. I don't want to compare Caleb Williams to Patrick Mahomes because I think at this point that's ridiculous. That said, he's excellent out of structure, could be better in structure. What I want for the Chicago Bears is steal Ben Johnson from the Lions, give him Caleb Williams, DJ Moore, Darnell Mooney, solid running game. Say let's get the Chicago Bears to be a perennial contender.
That's another fun one right there. I'm sure there's going to be some pushback about Justin Fields as the answer. And I think I would side pretty firmly with you on that one. Guys, before I provide my landing spot that I would like, my dream landing spot, remember, Theo is the OG Fantasy on Twitter. Check him out on PlayerProfiler.com. Check out all of the Player Profiler podcast content, media content. Promo code Theo. Get that all-in package for $75 rest of season. Ryan is Ryan Reynolds NFL on Twitter. All his work is on the33rdteam.com. Now, when I look at Caleb Williams, I would love to see him paired with one of the best receiving trios in the NFL. I'm looking at a team that's got 2 stud wide receivers, including maybe the best receiver in the game right now, along with one of the NFL's best tight ends. I would love Caleb Williams to play in a dome for at least half of his NFL games. I think any team he goes to becomes legitimate contenders for the next decade at least. And I would like to see him on the now analytically driven Minnesota Vikings.